Good evening, everybody. So we are very, very happy to see everybody joining today's webinar. And I'm also happy to share that today we are celebrating International Jazz Day. And with a big honor, I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker today, amazing person who is one of the drivers of English Without Borders and who launched this project in Tajikistan and still supports with the bottom of his heart English Without Borders whenever he is, and a person who is dedicated to teaching. So though he is teaching music, he taught music as well, but nevertheless, like we are very happy to welcome and also to introduce our speaker today, Alex Noppe. Welcome, Alex, to English Without Borders. And let me briefly introduce our speaker today. So Alex Noppe holds a Doctor of Music in Brass Literature and Pedagogy from Indiana University, as well as Master of Music in Trumpet Performance from the And beside that, Alex has been quite active from the very beginning of his career. He was a professor of music at the University of Wisconsin and several other universities, performing as a jazz, classical, and rock musician across the United States and internationally. He has also dual bachelor's degrees in trumpet performance and jazz studies from the University of Michigan. He joined the U.S. Department of State as a Foreign Service Officer in 2018 and previously was the Cultural Affairs Officer at the Dushanbe
Well, hello, everybody.
We can't hear you. Okay, yes, please, Alex, you can start. Thank you.
Hi, Gulnoro. Good to see you.
Hello, Alex. It's so nice to see you.
Yeah, it's so nice to be back here.
Yeah, feels like we've just started.
I know. I'm getting flashbacks from the last couple years of doing Zoom presentations for English Without Borders, and um, I wish I wish I was back in Tajikistan when we were able to do in-person programs. I think
Oh, yeah.
I left before we were able to really do a whole lot of those, and so
Yeah, we greatly miss your voice and the webinars you have conducted within our project as well as you signed. So thank you so much for everything you're still doing.
Yeah, thanks for so much for having me back. It's congratulations to the English Without Borders team and all of the members, and I've been watching on social media what's happening with the organization. It's really fun to see what everybody's been doing and all of the great work that you're doing. So thank you so much for having me back. And I guess I'll just start a little bit. So I'm here as not as an English teacher, of course. I was, before I joined the Department of State, a music teacher and a jazz teacher, and I'm a language student. So I have a lot of experience in the last couple years learning languages. I learned Russian before going to Tajikistan, and I just spent most of the entire year learning to speak Turkish. So I've done a lot of language learning, and what I've found is that learning to play music and learning languages is very, very similar. So I'm going to talk today a lot about learning learning music, specifically learning how to play jazz and teaching jazz, because I know that a lot of the people that are listening today, either on Facebook or on Zoom, are English teachers or English students. And so I'm going to try to talk about how the things that I would do as a jazz teacher are similar to the things that you might do as an English teacher or an English student. And what I thought I would do is start by just making sure everybody understands what jazz is. So jazz is a uniquely American form of music that that comes from a lot of other forms of music. It's a combination of classical music from Western Europe. It's a combination of African music that was brought to America through the slave trade. It's a combination of music from the Caribbean islands, specifically Cuba. And all of this forms American jazz about 100 years ago. And one of the main characteristics, the main features of American jazz is that it features improvisation. And if you don't know what improvisation is, the easy way to explain it is making things up. So a lot of jazz music is made up as you play it. And I think the best way to do this is just to give an example and play some jazz for you, and then we'll talk about language after that. So I have a piano here, and I'll tilt the camera down so you can see the piano a little bit. And I thought I'll just start by playing a little bit of jazz for you. It's 7 o'clock in the morning here in Washington, D.C., and there's an old joke among jazz musicians that says the only reason you should be playing jazz at 7 o'clock in the morning is if you're still playing from the last night's performance, and it just went on all night. I didn't do that, so I'm gonna try and warm up my fingers a little bit and play a little bit of jazz for you. So here we go. So that's a jazz performance. Thank you so much. It's fun to perform in front of an audience again. So it's good to see some of you on camera. Just to explain a little bit about what happened there, that was a very common jazz song called "There Will Never Be Another You." It's an old song from the 1930s or 40s, and what it featured was a couple different things. So one, in almost every jazz song is a melody, and you heard the melody. It's this part. And so I played that a couple times. And then it also features everything else that was going on. So we call that harmony, the bass of the music. And so the harmony sounded like this. So I played both of those things, and then in the middle, we talked about improvisation. And so I made up all of that stuff in the middle. And so if I were to play the same song for you, it would be similar, but most of the actual notes that I played would be different. So you would recognize it as the same song, even though I've never played it like that, and I never will play it like that again because I don't remember what I just played. So that's pretty typical for how a jazz performance goes. Now, why is this important, and why is this important for English Without Borders and for language learning? And the reason for me why I wanted to talk about jazz and play jazz for you today is, to me, learning to play jazz is very similar to having a conversation in another language. If you take other forms of music like classical music, or even a lot of popular music, you know before they play how the song is going to go, because it pretty much happens the same way every single time. Same thing with a lot of the music that you listen to. If you turn on a performance of the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or Katy Perry or Bruno Mars or anybody you're listening to these days, you pretty much know how they're going to sing their songs. They're going to sing the same words every time. It's going to be pretty much the same melody. And so that's a little bit more like what I'm doing today, talking to you, is having a scripted presentation to give. Where jazz, on the other hand, jazz is a conversation between the different players in the band, and the conversation is different every single time, just like how you would always use language. You can practice in the English classroom a million times, and you can practice saying, for example, if I were to meet you on the street, you've learned that I would say hello, and you say hello back, and then I would say, how are you? And you say, I'm fine. Except I'm not going to say hello every time. I might say hi, or how's it going, or what's up, or what's new. And all of those are a little bit different, right? And so no matter how many times you practice for a conversation, the conversation is not going to go exactly how you practiced. And so that is a skill that you have to learn. And for the teachers out here, that is a skill that you have to teach your students, to be flexible, to be able to listen to what's happening in a conversation and respond to it. So how do we do that in the music classroom? And so what I'll do today is I have about 6 or 7 points that I want to make of how I would teach jazz and how my students would learn to play jazz, and how this might work in the language classroom. So Number one, let's talk about how the brain works for a second. Your brains are very, very powerful computers, but what they're not actually good at is doing complicated things. What your brain is very good at is doing simple things very, very fast and many simple things at the same time. So your brain is good at multitasking with very simple things. So the way that you do complicated things like playing music or having a conversation in English is by learning to do these simple things over and over and over and over and over until they become automatic and you don't have to think about them anymore. I'm not really thinking about exactly what I'm going to say to you because I've been speaking English for, well, almost 40 years now. For those of you that have been learning English for much shorter periods of time, you're probably always thinking about, here's the next thing I'm going to say, and here's how I want to say it. And of course, when you're doing that, while you're thinking about what the next sentence I'm going to say is, you're not listening in the conversation. You're not participating. You're not listening to what the other people around you are saying. And that's normal. That's totally normal. So what you have to do in the classroom is practice the simple stuff so many times that you just do it automatically without thinking. And that is many more times, for the teachers, that is many more times than you think. Once your students get something right, great. So they've gotten something right. Now they need to do it over and over and over and over and over. And so in music, we often do that with things like scales. So here's a scale. And I would practice that in all different keys. And over again. I think I've probably played scales like that 10, 15, 20,000 times at least. There's a reason why I haven't played a scale on a piano, I think, in at least a year. And I can still play them just fine because as a music student, I played those scales so many times. And I would do different jazz patterns. I would take a scale and take this scale and make it into a pattern. Or things like that. And I would do those drills every single day because now when I want to play something like that in the middle of a song, for example, right, is not much different from the scale. Right? So you hear me playing that same scale during the song. And so this is why we practice these skills over and over until they become automatic skills. So you can take the really simple stuff in the classroom and do that over and over. Okay, number 2. This is, I think, one of the most important ones. Going back to the idea that the brain is really good at doing simple things and not so good at doing complicated things, it's important to break the complicated things into little pieces and have your students play little piece, or not play, sorry, your language students. Have your students speak little pieces rather than big complicated things all at once, at least until the little pieces get automatic. And I'll show you how we do this with music, and then I'll give an example of how we do it with language. So one of the first things that most jazz students learn how to play is something called the blues, and this is what the blues sounds like. You've probably heard something that sounds like that before, because many different types of music are based on the blues. Now, when I'm teaching my students to play the blues, what I would often do is give them just a couple pieces to work with, rather than saying, you can play anything you want, which is really complicated for students. I would say things like, you have 3 notes to use. For example, those 3 notes, and that's all you get to use when you play the blues. And you see, it works. You can play the blues with only 3 notes. And it's much easier for students to be able to play something that sounds good to them with only 3 notes. Once they get 3 notes, then maybe I give them a couple more notes and say, okay, you can use these 3 and these 2 more. Sudden, that actually almost sounds like music. It doesn't sound like I'm doing an exercise with very specific rules. And then maybe I can add a couple more notes or give them different notes to play. And pretty soon, as they figure out how to do those small tasks, then they can start figuring out how to play more complicated things. And so how do you do this with language? A good example of complicated things that you can break down into small pieces is learning to say numbers. Numbers are always really difficult for students. I know I always had a really hard time with learning numbers in my languages. And so one thing you can do is, of course, have the students practice very simple tasks, like go around the classroom and have them count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now let's do tens, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, 200, 1,000, 2,000. Okay, now everybody go around and say the year that you were born, right? 2002, 1994, 1965, things like that are simple. They're not actually using the numbers in a sentence. And do that until it's automatic. And then maybe once they can do that automatically, then say, okay, now let's all say a sentence. I was born in 1974. Right? I started school in 2011. Things like that. And that's how you put complicated tasks together in little pieces. Another thing that I would often do with students to make complicated things easier is we would do what's called call and response. Is I would play something as a teacher, they would play it back to me. And I can do that with the blues and show you an example. So in this example, this part here on the keyboard will be the teacher, and this part up here will be the students. So you can see what I'm doing is I'm playing something simple, and then I'm having the student play it back to me. And you can do that in the language classroom too. Which brings me to my next point about language learning. Language learning is, and jazz learning, is something that happens with your ears and something that happens with your voice, much more so than something that happens through books or very academic learning. So the way that jazz musicians originally learned to play this music was by going out to clubs and going out to performances and listening to other great jazz musicians. Jazz, like I mentioned, jazz is about 100 years old. It started around 1916 through 1920. And jazz education, the way that we think of jazz education today, learning in a school or a university or having books written about it, that didn't really start until the 1960s. So 40 or more years after people started playing jazz. So how did you learn how to play jazz before there were classes? Well, the same way you learned how to speak languages before there were classes. All of you have a native language, and none of you learned that native language in school or from a book. You learned it at home by listening to your parents and your relatives speak the language. And you don't remember learning how to speak that language. It just happened automatically because you listened to it so much. And it's the same thing with learning jazz. You have to listen to the music. So I would make my students listen to recordings all the time. It was part of their homework and part of the thing that they would have to do regularly. In fact, one of the most common exercises that jazz students do is they listen to a recording and then they learn how to play that recording back on their own instrument. It's a process called transcription. And we do this all the time. I have notebooks that are filled with great jazz performances that I've listened to, learned how to play, and then wrote down on paper. So this works the same way in the language classroom. You will not learn how to speak English only by reading a book or only by studying the theory of the English language. You have to actually hear English being spoken. So unfortunately, there are so many resources for listening to great English, whether or not it's just getting on the internet and doing things like watching American television. I'm sure many of you language learners out there probably watch TV shows, watch sitcoms in English, and that's a great way to speak the language. I do a lot of listening to the news in the languages that I'm learning, especially because usually they speak clearly, maybe not always slowly, but at least clearly with good language. So you have to listen all the time, and for the teachers, you have to get your students to listen. I think all of you know this. You're always looking to find native English speakers and bring them into your classrooms. And I would recommend that you do this as much as you possibly can. One of the reasons why this is important is there are parts of the language that are really difficult to learn by telling somebody how to learn it. And jazz is the same way. And here's a great example of that. So one of the other characteristics of jazz is something called swing. And swing is really hard to describe, so I'll just show you the difference. So this is what it sounds like when I don't swing. It doesn't quite sound like jazz, right? So if I swing it, not swing, So you can hear the difference. It has something to do with how long every note is. It has something to do with the notes that I emphasize and the notes I don't. It has something to do with how I connect notes to each other. But even for somebody who has taught jazz for many years, it's really hard for me to explain to you how to swing. So in the classroom, I just didn't. I didn't try to explain to my students how to do it. I just showed them over and over and over, and they learned how to do it by listening. In the same way that nobody can teach you how to speak English with an American accent. I don't know how to describe an American accent, and I've had one for almost 40 years. The only way you can pick up things like accent and good pronunciation and the way that you would say a sentence in English is just by listening to it being done. So, of course, native speakers are the best for this, whether you find that on recording or video, or you actually are able to bring in native speakers into your classroom. And I know that fortunately now, at least in Tajikistan, we have some more native speakers around the country that you can bring into your classroom. And I know that English Without Borders can help to bring in native speakers in order to talk with your students. This is the best way to learn this language. The other thing as a teacher, the best way for your students to learn English is if they're hearing nothing but English, right? So whenever you're using Tajik or Russian or some other language in the classroom that your students know, they're not learning English. It's better to use English whenever possible, even when you're giving them instructions. And the way you can do that is speak slowly, leave a lot of room between your sentences. That way students can think about what you just said, and repeat instructions many times. Repeat your instructions more than once. Repeat your instructions 3 or 4 times, because every time you say, repeat your instructions, the students understand it better. But you're doing it in English, right? Don't do that in Tajik. Of course, the first day of class, the first week and month of class, when your students don't know any English words, that's different. But as you get through the class, use more and more and more English, because every time you do that, they're learning something. All right, that was point 3. Point 4, I talked about jazz as a conversation. It's the same thing with language. This is a little bit weird right now because I'm not actually having a conversation, I'm just delivering a presentation. So it's possible for me to write out everything I was going to say today and just say it back to you. I'm not doing that. That seems like a lot of work, and I don't think I need to do that to speak English. So it's the same thing with learning language. You need to practice having a conversation, which means having your students involved in speaking to each other. All of you probably are familiar with the situation in the classroom where your students only talk to you as the teacher, and they don't talk to each other. And anything that happens, your students look at you and they talk to you. That's what happens in most classrooms, unless you as the teacher actively make your students talk to each other and start right away. So have your students ask questions to each other. Have your students respond to each other. Have your students, instead of, for example, a lot of language lessons start with the students come in and the teacher says, hello, how are you doing? How was your day? What did you do yesterday? I think I did this about 100 times learning Turkish, is the teacher would come in and say, what did you do yesterday? And we would talk about our day yesterday. Now, you can have the students tell you, the teacher, what they did yesterday. Or you can have the students tell each other what they did and have them talk to each other about it. And that way, they're actually listening. I know as a language student, it's hard for me to listen to the other people in the class if I'm thinking about what I'm going to say next. I'm thinking about, all right, what's my next sentence? How do I sound smart? How do I sound like I know how to speak this language? And then I stop listening to the people around me. So you have to force your students to talk to each other. And fortunately, that's something you can do pretty easily as a teacher. Just start early in the class so that once your classes have been going on for a couple days or a week, your students know how to talk to each other. There's a question in the chat, and you can start putting questions in the chat anytime you want, or put them on Facebook, and I'll either answer them right now or I will answer them at the end of the presentation. This is actually a good question that I see in the chat. What about students who think they're tone deaf? In other words, students that don't really hear music well. I would argue as a jazz student that very, very few people are actually tone deaf, who are actually unable to hear music very well. I think that there are students who are better at certain skills and better at other skills, or worse at other skills. So, for example, there are some students who are very good listeners, and they learn by hearing. I know some students that the best way you can get them to learn is just demonstrate for them, and they'll hear it and they'll do it themselves. Some students are really good at that. Some students are really good visual learners. They need to see it. So they can hear a sentence, but they need to see the sentence written for them to really understand it. Some students, the best way that they can learn is by saying things or by writing it themselves. You know, for me, I find that I learn vocabulary much better when I actually write the word. So when I'm learning new vocabulary, I write it in my notebook, and then I go and put it. I have an app on my phone that makes flashcards. So then I go and put the word into the app, and so I've actually written it 2 times, and that's how I learn better. You are going to have students with all of these different learning styles in your classes all at once. And so in order to reach all of those students, you need to do things that engage students who are visual learners, who are oral learners, who are learners by speaking and doing. So every day you should have exercises that are visual, exercises that are oral and listening, exercises that have the students speaking to each other. And that's how you engage those different learners. There are students that will think, I have a really hard time understanding language. I actually think I'm one of them. It's much easier for me to read than to listen to language. I'm just better at reading, and so I have to make myself spend more time listening. You know, I understand it's a skill that I have to develop. And that actually brings me to my point number 5, which is many of you are teaching language in big classes, at least 10 or 12 students, and sometimes maybe more like 20 students. I know there are some classrooms where you're even trying to teach language with 30 or 40 students, and that's really hard. It's really hard to do because students learn best from speaking the language, and so that you have to find time for your students to speak. When you have a big class, when one student is speaking, the other students are not. So some of the things that we did in music to deal with the exact same problem, when somebody is playing, the other students are not, and they're not learning as much. So I would do things like having students trade little phrases back and forth. I'll try to demonstrate that there's a technique in jazz called trading fours, where each student would play 4 measures at a time. I'll try to demonstrate that with the blues. Here's the other student. Another student. Another student. Another student. Another one. So we keep switching between students. Another thing that I would do is while one student is playing, I would have other students play simple things in the background, like something like that, that still has them playing jazz, but not getting in the way of the student who's playing a solo or the melody. And I can have the students make up those background things. I would tell one student, you make up a background and everybody else will copy you. So something like, right? This is easy to copy. All of you listening could probably sing that back to me after I played it a couple times. And so that's one way of getting students to be involved in the class while somebody else is also speaking. You can do this in the language classroom. That's not that hard. You can have students get in pairs and talk to each other and then talk back to the class. I see that happen a lot. You can have students, one student speaking and the other students writing things down. A lot of times I would have one student speaking and then I would ask another student, okay, what did she say? Tell me back what she said. Or now you answer the question. What did that student answer? And always trying to have the students speaking something. This is really hard to do, but there should almost never be a 5-minute period of time that goes by in class where students haven't spoken or they haven't had a chance to be interactive. That takes a lot of preparation as a teacher. You have to move very quickly in the classroom and you have to work hard to make sure that every student is participating. As your classes get a little better, you can have students teach the class, right? And let's see, we are, I know, running out of time a little bit, and there are some questions that I want to answer and probably some more questions that will come in. Let me answer a couple of these questions and then I'll make one more point at the end. So here's a question. How do you think which areas of foreign language skill are most affected the most by music? So I'm not a scientist or a linguist. I think I understand how the brain works, but not as a scientist. So I think that personally, the areas of the brain that help to process speech and understand speech are probably the same areas that help to process music. So I think that learning music makes it easier to learn language, because it is the same type of skill. And we talk a lot about like 4 technique learning in language. So learning, speaking, writing, listening, and what's the other one? Speaking, writing, listening, and something else I can't remember. Language teaching as well, but in music, it's playing, listening, and writing, all of which are the same thing. And so this is this is very similar to learning languages. There's a question, what type of music training is sufficient for better effects for language learners? That's a really good question. And I don't think there's a great answer for this question. I think the best answer really is the more different types of music that you learn and the more different ways of learning it, the better you're going to be at it. And it's probably the same thing for language. So students that only learn one form of music, that only learn how to play, say classical music, are not as versatile and not as flexible and strong at music as students that learn to play classical and jazz and rock and music from different places around the world. They just end up better musicians. And I think it's the same thing with language. So learning a lot of different forms of speech, learning very formal presentation type of speech, learning slang, learning to speak in conversation, and that also goes back to, I think, listening a lot to language learners and doing things like watching a lot of TV or listening to podcasts. There's a lot of really good podcasts available these days for English language learners. That's how I think I would answer that. Here's a great question. Is the level of excitement for learning a new note in music the same as learning a new word in a foreign language? Kind of, yes. What we would do in jazz is you listen to your favorite players and you might hear them not play a note, but play a pattern of notes, something like that. And I might hear my favorite player play that and think, oh, that is so cool. I love how that sounds. And so I would listen to them play that over and over and over again and try to copy it and try to play it on my instrument. And then once I could do that, try to figure out how to use that in a song. So I'm now trying to apply that. And it's probably the same thing in learning languages. I hear a new word or a new phrase, a new idiom. I love idioms in different languages, and then I try to figure out how to use them in my conversation. So yeah, absolutely. For me, it's the same level of excitement. Why did I choose jazz? That's a question that came in. I don't know. I think it found me. I love jazz because of how creative it is, because how every single time you play the same song, but it doesn't sound the same. The songs that I've played for you today, I've played these hundreds of times, and they're still fun because I can do something different every single time. I can take the song that I played and play it completely differently than the way I did today, and I might do that tomorrow. So that to me is why jazz has become really, really interesting and fun to play. There's a question, how does music help you in learning Turkish? I think it's a lot of the stuff that we've talked about already. One of the things that helped me in learning Turkish, because I spent so many years teaching music and teaching jazz, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how I learn as a student and what helps me learn the best. And that has really helped my Turkish. I know the types of things that I need to do to help me learn. I know what makes me learn faster. I know what I like to do in the classroom. I know what I don't like to do in the classroom. If you're a language student, I think you can think about, how do you learn the best? What makes you enjoy learning the best? And do more things like that. As a teacher, you need to try and figure out, how do your students learn the best? What exercises in the classroom, what homework, what projects, what conversations, what really makes them learn? Every student is going to be different, and every class is going to be different. So this is something that happens all the time. You will never, as a teacher, not be listening to your students and trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And that actually brings me to the last point that I really wanted to make, was about assessment, in that you're constantly, as a teacher, constantly assessing your students. You can do this as a formal assessment and give them a test or something like that, or you can just listen to them. You as the teacher know very well how your students are doing. And you should always, anytime you finish a lesson, you should probably know, this worked. Here's the things that worked in my lesson that my students really learned how to do. Here's the things that didn't, or that didn't work as well. And every single class, every single lesson that you teach, some things are going to work and some things are not going to work as well. That's okay, right? You should, of course, come into the lesson with a plan, but just like playing jazz, don't be afraid to change the plan if you see that something isn't working or something you're doing is working really well. The best teachers are very, very flexible in the classroom. And so it's flexible that can be even during a lesson. If you see you're doing something with your students and it's not working, they are bored, they're not understanding it, it's making them upset, change, do something else. Try something else. And good teachers have in their head a really long list of teaching techniques that they can use in the classrooms, that especially if something's not working, you can change to another one. If you don't have a big list of teaching techniques in your head, where can you find one? Well, English Without Borders probably has hundreds and hundreds of resources for you. I know the English Teaching Forum magazine comes out a couple times a year, and there's always teaching tips in there. I know that there's teaching tips all over the website, the EVB website. So have in your head this collection of ideas. It's the same thing at the end of your lesson. Every teacher should finish a lesson and think about what went well, what didn't go well, and how am I going to change tomorrow's class or the next class to deal with the things that my students still don't know how to do, right? There should always be that flexibility. And if you don't know what your students are understanding and what they're not understanding, listen to them, right? Ask them questions, make them do something they're not comfortable with, right? You know as language teachers that you can have your students practice a presentation, practice some sentences, and then when a guest comes into the classroom, they can say their sentences back in English and they sound like they can speak English. But what happens when you try to have a conversation with them and talk about things that aren't what they've practiced? Are they still so good, right? And you know this as a teacher, what they're good at and what they're not. Make sure you're always thinking about this in the classroom. There's a couple more questions. Which language, in your opinion, sounds more musical? Oh, that's a cool question. There actually are languages that are inherently more musical because they are tonal languages. A lot of the languages like Chinese and Korean, the Eastern Asian languages, it's a completely different word if I say hello versus hello versus hello. That's three different words in a language like Mandarin Chinese. And so I've often heard that musical skills really help in learning those languages. It's too hard for me, so I'm going to stick with my Turkish for right now, which is not. And then there's another question: can you play some music and use words from a language you were learning to practice pronunciation, vocabulary, and meaning? I don't entirely understand the question, but there's two answers that I can give. One is that using songs can be a really, really good way of learning language in the classroom. If you take a sentence and you connect the sentence to music, then it's often really much easier for people to understand it. So songs are great as long as they're clear and easy to understand. The other way I can answer that question is anytime I'm playing, I can absolutely try to use new stuff that I'm learning when I'm playing jazz. And the same thing with speaking English. If I learned a new word today, I might try to use that word in every conversation so that I can practice the word. And you can definitely do that. You could have a word of the day in your classrooms and have your students try to use this word as many times as possible. You can make it into a game even. That can be kind of a fun one. Let's see. Are there any other questions that have come in? I know we're getting near the end of the time. Somebody asked, can you perform music now? Do you want to hear one more song before we go? What do you think, Nasiba?
Absolutely. Like, everybody likes the way you play. It's just enjoyable. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so because it's International Jazz Day and celebration of jazz, we'll play one more song. And I'll play something that's in a different style because we talked about jazz having a lot of different styles. So here's something that more of a Latin American, Caribbean style. Okay, so
Bravo, bravo, bravo.
thank you.
It's awesome. It's awesome. I'm sure like all those who joined today's webinar, they enjoyed greatly your webinar. And it's really great that you shared wonderful tips um, how during your webinar, what jazz teaches us about language learning. It's awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, dear Alex, and happy International Jazz Day to you as well. So yeah, have a great day, and of course we'll be looking forward to having more webinars with you in the coming future. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me. It's so good to be back speaking to English Without Borders and seeing so many familiar faces and seeing so many friends here um, on Zoom and probably more on Facebook. I miss everybody there too a lot. So it's great to be back here.
Yeah. So dear all, please don't miss English Without Borders online activities. So stay tuned on us and keep following us on social media to be aware of English Without Borders activities and join them online or via in-person participation. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everybody, and have a great evening for all those who are in Tajikistan. Alex, thanks again so much.
Thank you.